Good morning, I'm Andrew Knight from Emmanuel at the Villas. We're looking this morning at 1 Corinthians chapter 8. Background to this, of course, is that the Apostle Paul is writing to the church in Corinth that he himself has planted and established. He lived in Corinth for at least 18 months. You can read about that in Acts chapter 18. And 1 Corinthians is a letter which, at least in part, is replying to a letter that the church in Corinth had written to Paul. And in their letter, they'd raised various questions about matters that were concerning or dividing them. And they wanted teaching from Paul about how to work out their faith in Jesus when it came to these particular issues. Chapter 8 is the answer to one of the questions that the Corinthian Christians had asked Paul. Before we look at their specific question, I'd like to just quickly think about questions in general. How do we deal with questions that come up in life where it is unclear about how to live as a Christian in some particular situation? Maybe Christians disagree on a particular matter. Maybe something makes you uneasy or your conscience troubles you about something. Well, what to do about those questions? Well, the Corinthians' response to a problem is very wise. They take the problem to someone with whom they have a relationship, someone who they're confident is a wise and mature believer. He knows them and he also knows their specific culture and place where they live. Chapter 4, verse 14, Paul's even described the Corinthian Christians as his beloved children. He cares about them. Why am I saying this? Well, because in our day, we can easily seek answers to our spiritual dilemmas just by going to the internet, rather than going to people who know us and who know our situation and who love us and are committed to praying for us. Those people who we should be going to are our fellow Christians, leaders, elders in our church. God's intended that his people should relate together in the community of the local church with oversight from leaders who know and who care about them. So you might get a brilliant answer from the internet. You might get a completely misleading and poor answer. There's wonderful online content and there's also rubbish. But the online voices won't come and walk side by side with you through the challenges of your life. So cherish and love your local church and ask your questions about your faith there. Okay, now let's look at the Corinthians' specific question in chapter 8. The question is it okay for Christians to eat food, and specifically meat, that has been offered or sacrificed to idols? Well, this might seem like a question far removed from us today, but the Holy Spirit has ensured that this question is preserved in the inspired scriptures, and it is therefore useful and applicable to us. If you've done any sort of study in classical civilization, you will have come across the pantheon of Greek so-called gods, and the background to the question the Corinthians have seems to be that if you brought meat in Corinth, it had most likely been sacrificed to some idol or god. And the equivalent of restaurants where you would eat this meat seems to have been some sort of temple mixed up in the worship of these idols. So, is it okay for Christians to buy and eat this meat? Is it okay for Christians to go into these temples and eat this meat? Is it okay to eat it with others? And what effect might eating this meat have on your relationship with God? And how might it affect your relationship with other Christians? These were the sort of issues the Corinthian Christians were struggling with. And this was a particularly pressing question for them because some people who had become Christians in Corinth had lived all their lives understanding that when they ate this meat, it was somehow part of their worship of that idol or false god. And so for them, it was a problem to eat it because it took them straight back to their pre-Christian idol worship experience. So, what was Paul's answer to the Corinthians? And how can we unpack that to get some application for us in our situation today? Well, there were two parts to Paul's answers: knowing and loving. There are some matters, we might perhaps call them issues of conscience, where, says Paul, showing love to your fellow Christians is more important than being correct, being right and showing you're right. He, of course, unpacks this particularly in chapter 13, the famous passage about love. Just as an aside, there are, of course, behaviours that the Bible explicitly condemns, no doubt. Cheating, murder, theft, injustice, sexual immorality, and so on. That's not the sort of thing we're talking about here, but rather we're talking about matters where sincere Christians are divided and maybe differ due to perhaps cultural background, life experience. So, knowing and loving. In terms of knowledge, says Paul, this food sacrificed to idols really is no matter. You can eat it. Go ahead. Verse 8. Food will not commend us to God. We're no worse off if we do not eat it, no better off if we do. And verse 4. An idol has no real existence. So, is that simply the answer to the question? Go ahead and eat the meat? Well, no. Because there were these Christian converts from pagan religions who had eaten this meat as part of their worship of an idol and who couldn't now bring themselves to eat it without the deeply ingrained experience of eating it as part of their worship coming back and it affecting them negatively. They felt they shouldn't be doing it. It made them feel unfaithful in their worship of God as Christians. So, what should those Christians do who understood that eating this meat really didn't matter in any spiritual sense? It wasn't false worship, it was just eating meat. Well, Paul's adamant. Those Christians should love their fellow Christians who have a problem with it. Don't push them to do something against their conscience. Be committed to building up and encouraging those you disagree with. At all costs, avoid anything that might cause a fellow Christian to sin. Verse 13, Paul says he'd rather be vegetarian than eat meat at the cost of someone else falling away from their faith in Jesus. So that's all very well, but what's that mean for us today? So thinking through this, what are the issues in our time and place that we can apply this to? I found it quite hard to think of some. And the very nature of a question means that my examples will be divisive. This was an issue that divided the Corinthians, so the question is about how to deal with divisive issues. Here's some possible scenarios. Halloween. Do you perhaps know that there's nothing wrong with letting your kids go trick-or-treating? Well, how do you feel act towards parents who have strong convictions against it? Another one, maybe your group of church friends enjoys a game of poker sometimes. What do you do when a new Christian friend joins the group and you find that for years he's battled a gambling addiction? Maybe your small group always enjoys a bottle of wine or two when you eat together. Well, what do you do when that new member comes along who has a potentially life-controlling alcohol addiction, who they've just broken free of? So these are, I think, similar to the sort of issues Paul was addressing. He's really presenting us with a radical challenge to the self-centered way of life that rules in our culture. Paul says, live your life with the priority of loving and building up your Christian brothers and sisters, and at all costs avoid doing anything that might cause them to sin or go against their conscience. If that means putting aside something that you have as a personal preference, putting that aside for the sake of loving someone else and helping them, then do it. It's what a lifestyle of worshipping Jesus looks like. As a church, we're about helping people find their way back to God. And that way back to God is through Jesus. He is our ultimate example of laying aside his own benefit for the sake of bringing us to God, laying down the riches of heaven to take on our humanity, even to death on a cross. God so loved the world that in Jesus he paid that price to bring us to God. So our knowledge, let it be used and to result in us loving God and loving others. God bless you today.